The leather chair creaked as James leaned back, his perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to his smug expression. "Emily, you have to understand," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Managing this kind of money requires experience, business sense, things you just don't have." I sat across from him in his home office, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. The inheritance papers from my grandmother's estate lay scattered across his massive mahogany desk. $12 million worth of assets, properties, and investments that he was so desperate to control. My name is Emily Chen, and at 42, I was watching my husband of 15 years try to manipulate his way into controlling my inheritance. The same man who had spent years subtly undermining my confidence, making me question my own judgment, was now showing his true colors in full force. "I've already spoken with our lawyer," James continued, straightening his tie with practiced precision. "The power of attorney paperwork is ready. Once you sign, I'll handle everything. You won't have to worry your pretty little head about it." The condescension in his voice made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression neutral. James had always been controlling, but he'd masked it well over the years. Small comments about my spending habits, suggestions that I shouldn't work because he made enough for both of us. Gentle criticisms about my decision-making that eroded my confidence bit by bit. But what James didn't know, what I'd made sure he didn't know, was that I wasn't the same naive woman he'd married 15 years ago. The past 6 months since my grandmother's passing had opened my eyes to things I'd been blind to for far too long. It started with a letter my grandmother had left me, along with the inheritance. "My dearest Emily," she'd written, "with this gift comes great responsibility, but also great opportunity. Trust yourself. You are stronger and smarter than they've led you to believe." Those words had struck something deep within me. My grandmother had always seen through James's facade, though she'd never directly criticized him. Instead, she'd spent years quietly preparing me for this moment, teaching me about investments, business, and most importantly, self-reliance. The day after I received the inheritance notice, I made an appointment with Sarah Chen, no relation, a financial advisor my grandmother had recommended. James didn't know about these meetings. I'd scheduled them during what he thought were my yoga classes. "Your grandmother was a shrewd businesswoman," Sarah had told me during our first meeting. "She built this fortune from nothing, and she chose you to carry on her legacy. Not your husband, not your cousins. You." Over the next few months, while James was busy plotting how to take control of my inheritance, I was quietly putting things in motion. Weekly meetings with Sarah, consultations with my own lawyer, not the family lawyer James had chosen, and careful documentation of every manipulative comment and action from my husband. I'd learned that James had been making inquiries about the inheritance before my grandmother's will was even read, speaking to financial advisors and lawyers about how to protect the assets. What he really meant was how to control them. Now, sitting in his office, watching him lay out his plans as if they were already set in stone, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear and self-doubt he cultivated in me for years had been replaced by something stronger, certainty. "Are you listening, Emily?" James's sharp tone cut through my thoughts. "This is important. We need to get these papers signed before the estate is fully settled." I met his gaze, keeping my voice steady. "I hear you, James. You want power of attorney over my inheritance." He smiled, that practiced, patronizing smile I'd seen countless times before. "Exactly. You know, I only want what's best for us, for our future." What James didn't know was that I'd already secured my future without him. The meetings with Sarah hadn't just been about financial planning. We created a comprehensive strategy to protect my inheritance and my independence. 2 weeks ago, I quietly moved most of my personal savings to a new account at a different bank. The inheritance itself was already protected by an ironclad trust my grandmother had set up, one that explicitly prevented anyone else from gaining control without my consent. But the real surprise was something else entirely, something that would wipe that smug smile off James's face when he finally discovered it. "You seem distracted," James said, frowning slightly. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, standing up from my chair. "Everything's fine. I just need some time to think about all this. It's a big decision." He stood as well, coming around the desk to place his hands on my shoulders. His touch, once comforting, now made my skin crawl. "Don't overthink it, honey. You know I'll take care of everything." That night, As James slept soundly beside me, convinced his plan was working perfectly, I lay awake thinking about how different things would look in just a few days. The pieces were already in motion, set up carefully over months of quiet preparation. I thought about the moment James would realize what I'd done, how his carefully constructed facade would crumble. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. The next morning, James was already in his office when I came downstairs. I could hear him on the phone, his voice carrying through the closed door. "Yes, everything's proceeding as planned," he was saying. "She'll sign the papers this week. No, she has no idea about any of it. Trust me, I know how to handle my wife." I felt a familiar twist in my stomach at his words, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Determination. I pulled out my phone and pressed record, adding yet another piece of evidence to my growing collection. Later that day, I met with Sarah in a small cafe across town. James thought I was at my book club. Another convenient excuse I cultivated over the months. "Everything's ready," Sarah said, sliding a folder across the table. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I opened the folder, reviewing the documents inside. Everything was there: bank statements, transfer records, and most importantly, proof of James's attempts to manipulate his way into controlling my inheritance. "I'm sure," I replied, closing the folder. "He's left me no choice." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "The meeting with the estate lawyers is scheduled for tomorrow. James thinks it's just a routine signing, doesn't he?" "Yes," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "He has no idea what's really going to happen." That evening, James was in an unusually good mood. He ordered takeout from my favorite restaurant, opened an expensive bottle of wine, and was being extra attentive. I knew what this was: his way of buttering me up before the meeting tomorrow. "I've been thinking," he said as we sat down to dinner. "After we get everything sorted with the inheritance, we should take a vacation. Maybe that trip to Europe you've always wanted?" I smiled, playing along. "That sounds lovely." He reached across the table to take my hand, his thumb stroking my palm in what he probably thought was a soothing gesture. "I know all this legal stuff has been stressful for you, but after tomorrow, you won't have to worry about any of it. I'll handle everything." I squeezed his hand gently, thinking about how different things would look in just 24 hours. "You're right, James. After tomorrow, everything will be different." As we got ready for bed that night, I watched him go through his usual routine, checking his phone one last time, setting out his clothes for tomorrow, meticulously arranging everything just so. James had always been about control, about maintaining the perfect image. "Big day tomorrow," he said, climbing into bed beside me. "Try to get some sleep." I lay there in the dark, listening to his breathing even out as he drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would indeed be a big day, just not in the way he expected. I thought about the past 15 years, about all the little moments that had led to this. The way James had gradually isolated me from my friends, how he'd discouraged me from pursuing a career, his constant subtle criticism disguised as concern. But I also thought about my grandmother, about her strength and wisdom. She'd seen this coming long before I had, and she prepared me for it in her own way. "Remember, Emily," she told me once, "true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about having power over yourself." Tomorrow, I would finally show James exactly what that meant. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I watched James get ready for the meeting, methodically knotting his silk tie and adjusting his cuffs. Every movement precise, controlled, just like everything else in his life. "Wear something professional," he said, eyeing my casual attire with disapproval. "First impressions matter, even if it's just a signing." I nodded, hiding my amusement at his assumption that this was just another signing. While he finished getting ready, I changed into a tailored navy suit, one my grandmother had helped me pick out months ago. "Every warrior needs proper armor," she'd said with a knowing smile. The drive to the law office was quiet. James kept glancing at me, probably interpreting my silence as nerves. His hand patted my knee in what he likely thought was a reassuring gesture. "Just follow my lead," he said as we pulled into the parking lot. "Let me do the talking." The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied the entire top floor of a sleek downtown building. As we stepped out of the elevator, I saw James's shoulders straighten, his game face sliding into place. He had no idea what was waiting for us behind those glass doors. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston," the receptionist greeted us with a professional smile. They're ready for you in the main conference room. James strode ahead of me, confident as always. But when we entered the conference room, his steps faltered. Instead of just the estate lawyer he expected, the long table was occupied by several people. Sarah Chen, my financial advisor, Marcus Wong, my personal attorney, and Catherine Morrison herself, the firm's senior partner. "What's going on?" James asked, his voice sharp. "I thought this was just a signing." "Please have a seat," Catherine said, gesturing to the chairs. "We have quite a bit to discuss." I took my seat at the head of the table, not beside James where he clearly expected me to be. His face tightened as he lowered himself into a chair, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrests. Catherine opened a folder in front of her. "Mrs. Preston has asked us to review some concerning matters regarding her inheritance and your recent attempts to gain power of attorney." James's head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. "Emily, what is this?" "Let me explain," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I know about everything, James. The calls to your lawyers about controlling my inheritance before grandmother even passed away. The consultations about having me declared financially incompetent. The offshore accounts you've been preparing." His face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's ridiculous. I've only been trying to protect our interests." "Our interests?" Sarah Chen cut in, sliding a document across the table. "Is that why you've been making inquiries about transferring Mrs. Preston's inheritance into accounts only you would control?" James's jaw clenched. "Emily, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, pulling out my phone. "In fact, let me play something for everyone." I pressed play, and James's voice filled the room. "Yes, everything's proceeding as planned. She'll sign the papers this week. No, she has no idea about any of it. Trust me, I know how to handle my wife." The color drained from his face as the recording continued, detailing his plans to gain control of my inheritance through whatever means necessary. "That's just taken out of context," he sputtered, but I could see the panic rising in his eyes. Catherine Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Preston, we have documented evidence of multiple attempts to fraudulently gain control of your wife's inheritance. Would you like to explain that?" James's composure finally cracked. "Emily," he hissed, "you have no idea what you're doing. You need me. You've always needed me." I met his gaze steadily. "No, James. I don't need you. I never did. What I needed was to see you for who you really are." Marcus Wong cleared his throat. "Mrs. Preston has already taken steps to protect her inheritance through a series of trusts that you cannot access." Additionally, he paused, sliding another document forward. "These are divorce papers." James stared at the papers, his face contorting with rage. "Divorce? You can't be serious. After everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done to me," I corrected. "The manipulation, the control, the constant undermining of my confidence, it stops now." "You'll never manage without me," he spat, his carefully maintained facade completely crumbling. "You're nothing without me. Nothing." I stood up, placing my hands flat on the table. "That's where you're wrong, James. I'm not nothing. I'm my grandmother's granddaughter, and she taught me better than to let someone like you control my life." Sarah Chen spoke up. "Mrs. Preston has demonstrated remarkable financial acumen over the past 6 months. She's already made several successful investment decisions that have increased her inheritance by 15%. James's head whipped around. 6 months? You've been planning this for 6 months? "Actually," I said, allowing myself a small smile, "grandmother and I had been planning this for years. She saw right through you from the beginning. Every lunch date, every shopping trip, she was teaching me, preparing me for this moment." Catherine Morrison pulled out another set of documents. "Mr. Preston, given the evidence of your attempted financial manipulation, we're prepared to file charges unless you agree to an uncontested divorce with the terms Mrs. Preston has outlined." James snatched the papers, his eyes scanning the contents. With each page, his face grew redder. "You can't be serious. You expect me to just walk away with nothing?" "Not nothing," I corrected. "You can keep your own assets, but my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy, that stays with me, where it belongs." "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You've all lost your minds." "No, James," I said quietly. "For the first time in 15 years, I'm thinking clearly. You have until the end of the week to decide. Sign the papers and walk away or face fraud charges. Your choice." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "You have no idea what you're doing." As he stormed out of the conference room, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Years of subtle manipulation, of doubting myself, of trying to be what he wanted. All of it falling away with each step he took. Catherine waited until the door closed behind him before speaking. "Are you all right, Mrs. Preston?" I nodded, surprised to find that I truly was. "Yes, I am. For the first time in a very long time, I really am." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. James, faced with overwhelming evidence of his attempted manipulation, finally signed the divorce papers. He moved out of our house, my house now, taking only his personal belongings. I heard through mutual friends that he was telling everyone I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I was making a huge mistake. But his words didn't have the same power over me anymore. Sarah helped me take full control of my investments, and true to my grandmother's teachings, I proved to be quite adept at managing my own finances. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was freedom, independence, and a chance to finally be myself. One evening, about a month after the confrontation, I was sorting through some old boxes when I found a photo album. Inside was a picture of my wedding day, James and me smiling at the camera, looking perfect and polished. But what caught my eye was my grandmother in the background, watching us with a knowing look. She'd seen it all coming, had prepared me for this moment long before I even realized I needed preparing. Her inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was about giving me the strength to stand on my own. I closed the album and walked to my home office, once James's domain, now my space. On the wall hung a photo of my grandmother and me, taken just months before she passed away. Her eyes sparkled with the same determination I now felt every day. "Thank you," I whispered to her image. "For everything." My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, another investment opportunity she wanted to discuss. As I read through the details, I couldn't help but smile. James had been so convinced I couldn't handle money, couldn't make decisions, couldn't survive without him. But here I was, not just surviving but thriving, managing my inheritance, making my own choices, and finally living life on my own terms. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I never would have imagined when I was caught in James's web of control. It wasn't always easy. Independence never is, but it was mine. And that made all the difference.